I was at 23,000 feet over the Sea of Japan when I saw physics stop working. When the sky became a geometry textbook written by someone who'd failed every exam and decided to solve equations with violence instead of mathematics. And in the bombardier's bubble below me, Lieutenant Harris made a sound that wasn't quite language, wasn't quite scream. Just raw human noise trying to process something the brain refused to categorize as real. And through the plexiglass, I could see what had frozen him, could see the enemy squadron. 14 fighters in perfect formation, rising toward us like angry wasps disturbed from a nest, their wings catching the morning sun in flashes of silver that would have been beautiful if they weren't carrying cannons designed to tear apart aluminum and flesh. And then I saw the thing that would haunt every member of my crew for the rest of our lives, this broken fighter dropping from above the Japanese formation at an angle that should have torn its wings off. Dropping so fast, it left a visible distortion in the air, like heat shimmer over desert highway, like the atmosphere itself was being wounded by the passage of something moving faster than air could accommodate. The fighter's silhouette was wrong, was asymmetric in a way that suggested catastrophic battle damage. One wing appeared shorter than the other, or maybe bent at an angle that would make controlled flight impossible, and it was trailing something that might have been smoke, or might have been some kind of vapor, or might have been the visual signature of reality, struggling to process whatever forces were acting on that airframe. And it didn't slow down when it reached the enemy planes, didn't maneuver in any way that resembled tactical thinking or the training we'd all received about deflection shooting and energy management. Just cut through that formation the way a bullet cuts through paper, and where it passed, fighters exploded not from visible weapons fire, no tracers, no cannon flash, no rockets or missiles, but from something else. From proximity or pressure or some force I had no name for, as though the broken fighter was erasing them from existence through sheer presence, through occupying space that other aircraft had presumed to occupy, and discovering that presumption was fatal. In the span of maybe 8 seconds, I know it was 8 seconds because I counted them later, replayed them in my head 10,000 times, trying to make sense of the impossible, trying to find the moment where what I thought I saw diverged from what actually happened. That entire enemy squadron ceased to exist. 14 aircraft transformed into falling debris and smoke trails and briefly bright explosions as fuel tanks ignited. And the broken fighter pulled out of its dive with a banking turn that should have subjected the pilot to G-forces fatal to human tissue, should have collapsed the airframe, should have resulted in the wings folding upward and the fuselage breaking apart. But instead, it climbed away into cloud cover like a ghost returning to whatever impossible realm had birthed it. And my co-pilot Ray Sullivan whispered into the intercom, his voice carrying the particular emptiness that comes from watching reality betray everything you thought was solid. What the hell was that? And nobody answered, because what were you supposed to say when you'd just witnessed war become witchcraft? When you'd seen a machine move like it was alive and angry, and had decided 14 men needed to stop existing right this second, when the fundamental rules that governed flight and combat and physics itself had been suspended for 8 seconds and then reinstated, leaving you to wonder if what you'd witnessed was real, or if the hypoxia everyone warned about at high altitude had finally caught up with you and was feeding your brain hallucinations so vivid they felt like memory. If you're watching, stay with me to the end and subscribe. Stories like this need witnesses. To understand how I ended up staring at the impossible from 20,000 feet over enemy water, we need to go back to Nebraska, to the training fields where they taught us to believe that B-29s were invincible because they flew higher and faster than anything the enemy could field. Back to the briefing rooms where intelligence officers showed us charts and graphs, proving our superiority through statistics that made war look like engineering problem rather than organized murder. And most importantly, back to the version of myself that still thought war was about machines and tactics, rather than the moments when both machines and tactics revealed themselves as children's toys, compared to whatever forces moved beneath the surface of organized violence. I joined up in 1942, fresh from a college education at the University of Nebraska that had taught me exactly nothing useful about survival, had filled my head with literature and philosophy and the kind of abstract thinking that made you excellent at cocktail parties and worthless in situations where people were trying to kill you with high explosive rounds. And I'd trained at bases in Texas and Kansas, where the sky was so big and empty you could convince yourself that flying was safe, was mechanical, was subject to rules that couldn't be violated by anything except engineering failure or pilot error. The instructors had been obsessive about procedure, had drilled into us the importance of checklists and instrument cross-checks and maintaining situational awareness, and they'd taught us to trust the numbers, the performance envelopes, the technical specifications that said a B-29 could cruise at 300 miles per hour at altitudes where enemy fighters couldn't reach us because their engines couldn't produce enough power in the thin air, and we'd believed it because believing it was easier than accepting that every mission was a dice roll, where the dice were loaded by factors nobody could quantify or predict or defend against. My crew was 9 men, including myself, and by the time we shipped to the Pacific in early 1945, we'd flown together enough that we'd developed the kind of silent communication that good crews build, where you knew what someone needed before they asked for it, where you could hear fear in someone's breathing pattern over the intercom, even when they were saying everything was fine, where you learned to read the subtle shifts in tone that indicated someone was at their limit and needed someone else to take over whatever task was overwhelming them. Ray Sullivan, my co-pilot, was a farm kid from Iowa who'd never been in an airplane until the Army taught him to fly, had spent his childhood operating tractors and combines and learning the kind of mechanical intuition that comes from working with machines that break down in critical moments and need fixing with whatever tools you have available. And he had this supernatural calm that made you trust him even when phosphorus was exploding around the aircraft and every instrument was screaming warnings about fire or structural damage or engine failure. He'd talk about his family's corn farm while we were under attack, would describe in careful detail the process of harvesting and storing grain, and somehow this mundane narration would steady everyone else's nerves, because if Ray could think about corn while fighters were shooting at us, then maybe the situation wasn't as desperate as it felt. Lieutenant Harris, in the bombardier position, was a mathematics teacher from Boston who'd volunteered because his wife had told him to either serve or explain to his children someday why he'd stayed home while other fathers went to war. And he handled the Norden bomb site like it was a holy relic, treated every bombing run like a moral equation that required perfect calculation to be justified, because the alternative was admitting that we were dropping incendiaries on cities full of civilians, and that precision bombing was a euphemism for setting neighborhoods on fire and hoping the factories we were aiming at burned along with everything else. He kept a notebook where he recorded every mission's target coordinates and estimated casualties, was trying to build some kind of statistical model that would prove we were making a difference, that the thousands of tons of explosives we were delivering were actually shortening the war, rather than just creating orphans and widows and survivors who would spend the rest of their lives hating America for what we'd done to their cities. Harris had nightmares, would wake up screaming in the barracks, and we'd all pretend not to notice, because acknowledging someone's psychological collapse meant confronting the fact that we were all walking that same edge. We're all one mission away from discovering that our minds couldn't process what our bodies were being asked to do. Our navigator, Sergeant Chen, was the only Chinese American in the squadron, had grown up in San Francisco's Chinatown, speaking both English and Cantonese, and he'd volunteered specifically to fight Japan because of what they'd done in China, The atrocities that Americans were only starting to learn about, but which Chen's family had been hearing about through letters and refugees for years. He had street maps of Japanese cities memorized in case we needed to bail out and evade capture, could read Japanese signage, and had learned enough of the language that he might be able to pass as Korean or Chinese collaborator if interrogated carefully. Though we all knew that being Chinese in Japanese custody was probably worse than being American, because the Japanese military had special hatred reserved for anyone who reminded them of their failures in the China campaign. Chen never talked about his family, never mentioned whether he had siblings or parents or a girlfriend waiting back home, had constructed a wall between his life before the war and his life during it, and that wall was thick enough that none of us felt comfortable asking questions that might breach it. The flight engineer was a guy named Morrison from Pittsburgh, had worked in steel mills before the war, and understood metal stress and structural integrity in ways that saved our lives multiple times when battle damage required mid-air assessment of whether the aircraft could make it home or needed to be abandoned. The radio operator was Patterson, nervous kid from Tennessee who'd wanted to be a journalist before the war and who kept an unauthorized diary recording everything we saw, writing in tiny, cramped handwriting in notebooks he hid in his flight suit. The gunners, waist positions and tail, were interchangeable in my memory now, not because they weren't important, but because gunner positions had high casualty rates and we went through several replacements, and learning to not get attached to people in high-risk positions was a survival mechanism that I'm not proud of, but which kept me functional when men I'd eaten breakfast with were dead before lunch. We'd lost aircraft from our group, watched bombers spiral down trailing fire or explode in mid-air when ordnance cooked off from battle damage, and after each loss, the surviving crews got quieter, developed superstitions, stopped making plans beyond the next mission because planning suggested a future, and futures felt like luxuries reserved for people who weren't deliberately flying into range of every weapon Japan could aim skyward. Morrison would touch the same spot on the fuselage before every mission, had convinced himself that this specific rivet was lucky, and Patterson would recite what sounded like a prayer, but was actually the opening paragraph of the Declaration of Independence, and Harris would arrange his pencils in specific order on his desk in the bombardier station. And we all knew these rituals were meaningless, but we also knew that meaning was whatever you could construct to make yourself believe that you had some control over whether you lived or died on any given Tuesday. The Pacific Theater had a particular horror to it, different from what the crews in Europe faced, because the distances were so vast that any significant damage meant you were ditching an ocean that could swallow your entire aircraft without trace, meant you were hoping for rescue by submarines that might or might not be in your sector, and even if they were, submarines couldn't surface during daylight in enemy-controlled waters, which meant you might watch your rescue swim past you while you tread water or clung to wreckage, knowing that once darkness fell, you'd be invisible in the waves and would probably never be found. The knowledge that capture meant torture created a level of stress that the flight surgeons tried to manage with pills and mandatory rest periods, but which mostly just accumulated in your nervous system until you either broke or became numb enough to function. And I could feel myself becoming numb, could feel the part of me that cared about abstract concepts like justice or heroism or the moral righteousness of our cause getting smaller and smaller until all that remained was the immediate tactical question of how to keep 9 men alive for another mission, another day, another hour. I'd watched good pilots develop tremors, watched navigators start making calculation errors because their minds couldn't focus through the fatigue and stress, watched gunners freeze during combat because the human brain wasn't designed to maintain peak alert for 6 or 8 hours straight while expecting death from any direction, And I'd started wondering how much longer I could maintain the appearance of competence before something inside me broke the way things had broken in other pilots who'd been grounded for medical reasons that everyone knew meant psychological collapse. The Army called it combat fatigue, which was a polite way of saying that your mind had looked at what war actually was and had decided that participation was no longer possible, that the gap between what you thought you could endure and what you were actually being asked to endure had become unbridgeable. And I could feel that gap widening every time we flew, every time we bombed another city and smelled the smoke rising from fires that would burn for days, every time we saw parachutes from aircraft that had been hit and knew that those pilots would be captured and interrogated and probably executed. And the worst part was that you couldn't admit any of this to anyone because admission meant being grounded. And being grounded meant your crew would fly with a replacement pilot who didn't know their habits and quirks. And that replacement might make mistakes that got them killed. So you kept flying because the alternative was abandoning people who trusted you, and that trust became a prison more secure than any cell. The mission brief that morning had been straightforward in the way that missions were always straightforward on paper, which was that we were hitting industrial targets in northern Japan, specifically a cluster of factories near Osaka that intelligence claimed were producing aircraft parts, and the briefing officer had shown us reconnaissance photographs of the target area and had explained the approach route and the defensive systems we should expect, and had told us that fighter opposition should be moderate because most of Japan's experienced pilots were dead and the replacements were flying on minimal training and maximum desperation, which was supposed to be reassuring, but which actually made things worse because desperate pilots did unpredictable things, like ramming bombers when they ran out of ammunition, like flying so close that you could see their faces through the canopy and see that they were teenagers, children really, who'd been handed aircraft and told to die for the Emperor. The weather forecast predicted clear skies over the target, which was good for bombing accuracy but terrible for survival, because it meant enemy fighters would have perfect visibility to find us, and anti-aircraft gunners would be able to track us precisely. And the whole briefing had the particular quality of men, explaining in technical language that we were about to do something very dangerous, and that some of us probably wouldn't come back, but that this was necessary for victory and for freedom, and for all the abstract concepts that made more sense when you weren't the one being asked to die for them. We'd taken off before dawn from Tinian, our B-29 loaded with 10 tons of incendiary bombs that would transform whatever they hit into firestorms, hot enough to melt metal and create winds that sucked oxygen out of the air and suffocated anyone who'd survived the initial impact. And we'd climbed to altitude over the ocean, while the sun rose behind us, turning the cloud layer below into a landscape of pink and gold that would have been beautiful if we weren't hauling instruments of mass death toward people who were about to burn. People who probably included children and elderly and civilians who had no say in whether their government continued fighting. And I'd learned to not think about that too directly, because thinking about it made flying impossible, made your hands freeze on the controls, and your mind start asking questions that had no good answers. We'd settled into the formation, 9 aircraft in elements of 3. Stacked and staggered so that our defensive guns could provide overlapping fields of fire, and we droned northwest for hours, listening to the engine's steady rumble and watching the fuel gauges tick downward while trying not to think about the fact that we were past the point of no return, that we were committed now to either completing the mission or dying because there wasn't enough fuel to reach any friendly territory if we turned back. And this calculation had become so routine that we didn't even discuss it anymore, just accepted that every mission divided itself into the phase where survival meant going forward and the phase where survival meant turning around. And we'd crossed that invisible line somewhere over the ocean while Chen made notations on his charts and Harris prepared the bomb site. and the gunners test-fired their weapons into empty sky to make sure everything was functioning properly. The Japanese coast appeared as a dark line that gradually resolved into the details of terrain we'd studied in reconnaissance photographs. The distinctive coastline, the river systems, the urban areas that showed up as geometric patterns against the agricultural landscape, and the flak started almost immediately. Black puffs blooming in the sky around us, with the particular menace of explosions that happened silently from inside a pressurized cockpit. So you saw the flash and the smoke, but heard nothing, which created this surreal disconnect between the visible evidence of people trying to kill you and the absence of sound that your brain expected. And we made our adjustments by watching where the flak was concentrating and trying to fly through the gaps, while knowing that the gaps were probably predicted paths and were being targeted even as we chose them. The anti-aircraft fire was intense enough that we could see other bombers in the formation taking hits, could see pieces of metal spinning away from fuselages and wings, could see engine fires starting and getting extinguished by crew or not getting extinguished and forcing the aircraft out of formation. And Morrison came on the intercom to report that we'd taken shrapnel damage to the No. 3 engine and that he was monitoring oil pressure and temperature. And his voice had that careful neutrality that meant the situation was serious but manageable as long as nothing else went wrong, which was always the gamble, whether you could nurse a damaged aircraft through the remainder of the mission or whether the damage would cascade into catastrophic failure. Harris called out landmarks for the bomb run, his voice switching into the particular mechanical cadence he used when he was focused entirely on the bomb site, treating the moment like a mathematics problem that required precise input to produce accurate output, and the aircraft settled into that steady, straight flight that bombardiers needed, but which made you feel like a target in a shooting gallery, unable to maneuver, unable to take evasive action, just holding course and altitude, while every anti-aircraft battery in range tried to bracket you with explosions. We were maybe 3 minutes from bomb release when Chen's voice came over the intercom with the kind of controlled urgency that meant something was very wrong, that the situation had just transformed from routine mission to active emergency. And he said, "Multiple bogies at 10 o'clock high, descending fast, count 14, formation looks tight, they're diving on the lead element." And then his voice changed, took on an uncertain quality that I'd never heard from him before, and he added, "Wait, there's another contact above them. Single aircraft. Trajectory's wrong, descending too fast. It looks damaged." I looked where he indicated and saw them, saw the enemy fighters in their distinctive profile, the elliptical wings and streamlined fuselage that intelligence had taught us to recognize, rising from below in a climbing attack that would bring them level with us in maybe 30 seconds. Their formation tight enough that they were clearly experienced pilots who'd trained together and knew how to coordinate their attack runs for maximum effectiveness. And I was already calling evasive maneuvers to the formation leader when Harris interrupted with something that didn't make immediate sense, said there was another contact above the enemy formation, single aircraft moving erratically, and even through the plexiglass I could see it, this dark shape that was moving differently from the coordinated grace of the enemy squadron, moving like something that had been broken and was falling, but was somehow still flying, and its wings looked wrong, looked asymmetric, like maybe battle damage had torn off part of the aileron or bent the structural members. And it was dropping toward the enemy fighters in what appeared to be either a deliberate attack or a pilot who'd lost control and was riding his damaged aircraft down in a final dive. And I remember thinking that whoever was in that broken fighter was dead, was already dead, was riding a flying coffin down into the enemy formation in some kind of desperate kamikaze attempt or last act of defiance. And part of my mind was calculating whether the collision would scatter the enemy formation enough to give us time to complete the bomb run, whether one pilot's sacrifice might save the rest of us. And then the impossible started happening, and calculation became meaningless. The broken fighter didn't slow down when it reached the enemy formation, didn't pull out of its dive, just kept accelerating through what should have been terminal velocity, kept gaining speed in a way that violated everything I knew about aircraft performance and drag coefficients, and the relationship between engine thrust and atmospheric resistance. And when it reached the first enemy aircraft, something happened that I still don't have vocabulary for. The enemy plane didn't explode from weapons fire, didn't show any visible signs of being hit by bullets or cannons or rockets. It just disintegrated, came apart into pieces that tumbled away like a child's toy, smashed by an angry adult, like the structural integrity had simply been cancelled. Like the molecular bonds holding the aircraft together had been informed they were no longer needed and had decided to stop functioning. And the broken fighter kept moving, kept cutting through the formation with turns that were too sharp, angles that were too extreme, movements that would have torn apart any aircraft I'd ever seen, because metal and rivets and structural engineering have limits, have stress tolerances that are calculated and tested and certified, and this thing was operating beyond those limits, like it didn't care or didn't know or had somehow decided that physics was optional, that the rules governing how aircraft moved through air were suggestions rather than laws. It moved through 14 fighters in the time it took me to inhale and exhale twice. Moved like it was editing reality, deleting aircraft from existence through proximity alone, without any visible mechanism for that deletion, no weapons fire, no collision, just presence, just occupying space that other aircraft tried to occupy, and discovering that occupancy was contested and fatal. Each enemy plane that it passed ceased to be a coherent object, became instead falling debris and smoke, and the brief bright flash of fuel igniting, and I could track the broken fighter's path through the formation by following the expanding cloud of destruction it left in its wake, this cone of violence spreading outward from its trajectory like the shock wave from an explosion. Except it was moving, was dynamic, was following a path that curved and twisted through three-dimensional space in ways that suggested intelligence rather than mechanical flight, suggested choices being made rather than ballistics being followed. The mathematical impossibility of it all was almost more disturbing than the violence, because I could track vectors and speeds and turn radiuses in my mind from years of flight training. Had spent hundreds of hours learning to calculate angles of attack and energy management and optimal maneuvering speeds, and nothing I was seeing matched anything that should be possible within the constraints of aerodynamics and structural engineering. The G-forces alone should have killed the pilot multiple times over, should have caused blackout at minimum, that temporary loss of consciousness that happens when blood drains from your brain during high G maneuvers, and probably should have caused G-lock, complete loss of consciousness, or even death from cerebral hemorrhage when blood vessels in the brain burst under pressure they weren't designed to withstand. Should have caused structural failure, should have resulted in wings folding upward from the stress of turning too sharply, should have torn control surfaces off, or buckled the fuselage, or exploded the engine from overstress. Should have resulted in a spinning debris field instead of controlled flight. But instead, the broken fighter was executing maneuvers that would have been impossible for any aircraft I knew about, was pulling instantaneous direction changes that violated the principle of inertia, was accelerating and decelerating in ways that suggested the pilot had access to thrust vectoring or some kind of propulsion system that could provide force in directions that conventional engines couldn't achieve. Sullivan was gripping the control yoke hard enough that his knuckles had gone white. And in my peripheral vision, I could see his face had taken on the expression people get when they're witnessing something that their brain is trying to reject, something so far outside normal parameters that accepting it means accepting that everything you thought you understood about how reality worked was incomplete at best, and wrong at worst. And his jaw was moving like he was trying to form words but couldn't find any that matched what his eyes were reporting. The intercom was filled with voices overlapping, crew members trying to make sense of what they were seeing, some of them shouting, some of them speaking in the monotone whisper that meant they'd gone somewhere else mentally and were just narrating what they saw, because the alternative was screaming or shutting down completely. And Harris kept saying, "That's not possible," like a prayer or a curse, saying it over and over while his hand stayed frozen on the bomb site controls, because he'd forgotten we were still on the bomb run, forgotten everything except the spectacle of physics being murdered in front of us. Patterson, the radio operator, was trying to contact the other bombers in the formation, was asking if anyone else was seeing this, if anyone could explain what was happening, and the responses that came back were just variations of confusion and disbelief. Pilots and crew members all watching the same impossible event and all failing to construct a narrative that made sense of it. Morrison had stopped monitoring the damaged engine entirely, had abandoned his post to press his face against a window trying to get a better view of the broken fighter, and I should have ordered him back to his station, but I couldn't because I was doing the same thing, was transfixed by the sight of something that couldn't exist, executing maneuvers that couldn't be performed, and achieving results that couldn't be achieved through any mechanism I understood. The broken fighter pulled out of its dive with a banking turn that I later calculated, because calculating was how I coped, how I tried to make sense of the senseless, would have subjected the pilot to somewhere north of 15 Gs, would have created forces on the airframe equivalent to dropping the aircraft from altitude and stopping its descent instantaneously, would have been like running into a wall at 300 miles per hour, except the wall was invisible and was made of air pressure and momentum. But instead of falling out of control or breaking apart, the aircraft climbed, actually gained altitude with acceleration that looked less like an engine producing thrust and more like the aircraft was being pulled upward by invisible cables, like someone had attached rockets to it or had decided that gravity was negotiable and had negotiated a better deal. It climbed through cloud layer above us and disappeared into the white, and below us the remains of the enemy squadron fell, 14 separate smoke trails marking where aircraft had been before the broken fighter taught them about erasure, taught them that existence was conditional and could be revoked by something that moved through the sky like an angry god. The sky was suddenly quiet in the way that battlefields go quiet after violence passes. This stunned silence, where even the flak seemed to have stopped, because maybe the Japanese anti-aircraft crews were looking at the same falling debris and trying to understand what had just protected a formation of American bombers by destroying their own fighters with methodical precision that suggested intelligence rather than mechanical failure or accident, suggested that something had made a choice about which aircraft deserved to continue existing and which aircraft needed to be removed from the sky with extreme prejudice. Harris finally completed the bomb run on something like autopilot, his hands moving through the familiar motions of releasing ordnance while his mind was clearly somewhere else, was still processing what we'd witnessed. And we felt the aircraft rise slightly as 10 tons of incendiaries dropped away and began their descent toward the target, and we turned for home while below us fires started that would eventually consume several square miles of city. But I was barely paying attention to that, was barely aware of the mission we'd just completed, because my entire consciousness was occupied by the question of what we'd just seen, what had moved through the air with such impossible grace and violence, what had saved us from an attack that probably would have resulted in casualties, if not complete destruction of our formation. The return flight was 4 hours of engine noise and silence, Each crew member alone with thoughts that didn't have language attached, because how do you describe watching the impossible? How do you build a sentence structure that accurately conveys the experience of seeing reality? Pause, seeing physics take a break, seeing something operate outside the rules that you thought governed everything. We landed on Tinian and taxied to our hard stand and shut down the engines, and normally there would be chatter, would be the nervous laughter and crude jokes that came from surviving another mission. But instead, we just sat there in the cockpit staring at nothing while ground crews swarmed around the aircraft, checking for damage and refueling and rearming for the next mission. And it wasn't until the flight surgeon came to the aircraft and asked if everyone was okay that we finally climbed out, finally returned to the reality where we were expected to behave like normal pilots who'd flown a normal mission. The intelligence officers came for our debriefs, gathered us in a room and asked the standard questions about target conditions and defensive fire and enemy fighter activity, and we tried to tell them what we'd seen, but the words came out wrong, sounded crazy even to our own ears, and the more we explained, the more obvious it became that they didn't believe us, that they thought we were suffering from combat stress or hypoxia or were confabulating from disconnected observations, creating a narrative to explain something mundane that we'd misinterpreted. When we insisted, when we all corroborated the same details about the broken fighter and the impossible maneuvers and the destruction of the enemy squadron without visible weapons fire, the senior intelligence officer's expression shifted from curiosity to concern, the kind of concern that meant he was now evaluating whether our crew was fit for flight status, whether we represented a psychological casualty that needed to be removed from operations before we infected other crews with our delusions. Harris produced his mission camera footage, the gun camera that was supposed to record bombing runs for damage assessment, and we all gathered around while they threaded the film through a projector, and we watched in growing frustration as the footage showed nothing, showed the bomber formation and showed flak bursts, and showed distant specks that might have been enemy fighters, but showed no detail, no evidence of the broken fighter or the way it had moved or the destruction it had caused. Just blur and distance and the inherent limitation of camera technology that couldn't capture what human eyes had seen, couldn't preserve the moment where reality had become negotiable. The intelligence officers looked at the film and then looked at us with the expression that confirmed what they were thinking, which was that we were a crew that had been through too much, had flown too many missions, had accumulated too much stress, and were now exhibiting the kind of group psychosis that sometimes emerged when men pushed themselves past their psychological limits and began sharing hallucinations because shared delusion was more comforting than admitting that your mind was breaking. The official mission report listed the enemy fighters as destroyed by defensive fire from the bomber formation, credited our gunners with the kills, and there was no mention of the broken fighter, no investigation into what had actually happened, no interest in pursuing an explanation that would require accepting that something existed in the Pacific theater that didn't match any known aircraft or capability. When Sullivan tried to push the issue, tried to demand that someone acknowledge that we'd witnessed something that needed explanation, the squadron commander called him into his office and suggested very strongly that combat fatigue was nothing to be ashamed of, and that continuing to make claims about impossible aircraft would reflect poorly on his fitness for flight status, and would result in grounding that would be permanent and would prevent him from flying for the duration of the war. And Sullivan understood the threat, understood that questioning the official narrative was being classified as psychological instability, and he stopped pushing, but he never stopped believing what we'd seen. So we learned to stop talking about it, except among ourselves, learned to carry the memory like shrapnel embedded too deep to remove safely. And we flew our remaining missions, 6 more before the atomic bombs fell and Japan surrendered, with the knowledge that somewhere above the Pacific there existed something that didn't follow the rules we'd been taught governed air combat, something that could erase enemy formations in seconds using methods that looked like sorcery. And the worst part wasn't that we'd seen it, but that nobody would believe us, that the event had been categorized as hallucination or fabrication, filed away in whatever mental drawer held things that didn't fit the official narrative of how the war was being fought and how victory was being achieved. We never saw the broken fighter again, never encountered any other situation that resembled that morning over the Sea of Japan. And part of me wondered if maybe the intelligence officers were right. Maybe we had experienced some kind of collective delusion brought on by stress and exhaustion and the particular cocktail of fear and adrenaline that came from flying combat missions. But I couldn't make myself believe that. Couldn't convince myself that 9 men had simultaneously hallucinated the same impossible thing in the same impossible way. After we rotated stateside in August 1945, after the atomic bombs fell and Japan surrendered, and we were all sent home to try becoming civilians again, I kept expecting someone to contact us, kept thinking that maybe military intelligence would want to debrief us properly, would want to understand what we'd actually seen, but that contact never came, and the war ended with that mystery unsolved, with those 8 seconds over the Sea of Japan existing only in the collective memory of 9 men who'd been there and who would spend the rest of their lives wondering if we'd witnessed experimental technology that someone had decided to keep secret, or psychological break that had somehow synchronized across an entire crew, or something that existed in the category of things that happened during war that nobody can explain and that everyone agrees to forget, because remembering would require admitting that reality was stranger and more dangerous than the official version suggested. I'm 83 years old now, writing this from a retirement home in Florida, where the other residents know I was a bomber pilot, but don't know about the broken fighter, because I learned decades ago that telling the story resulted in concerned expressions and suggestions that maybe I should talk to someone professional about my memories. Most of my crew is dead. Sullivan passed in 1987, still insisting he'd seen what he'd seen. Still angry that nobody had believed us, Harris died in 2003 from cancer that the VA attributed to radiation exposure from flying missions over Japan after the atomic bombs were dropped. Morrison was killed in a car accident in the 1970s. Patterson disappeared into journalism and published a book about the bombing campaign that mentioned nothing about the broken fighter because his publisher told him it would undermine his credibility. Chen vanished into the Chinese-American community in San Francisco and never spoke about the war again, as far as I know. Sent us all a single postcard in 1946 that said simply, "Some things are better left in the sky," and then cut all contact. The gunners scattered, and I lost track of them, heard secondhand that one had become a minister and another had drunk himself to death. Heard nothing about the others and assumed they're dead by now, given the actuarial tables and the fact that we're all well past life expectancy for men who spent formative years breathing high-altitude air and stress hormones. I'm telling this story now because I've decided that carrying it alone is worse than being thought crazy, that there's value in testimony even when testimony can't be verified, that somewhere in the archives there might be other reports from other crews who saw similar things and were similarly dismissed, and that if enough of us speak, then maybe the pattern becomes undeniable. Maybe someone will start asking questions that should have been asked in 1945. The broken fighter was real as the B-29 I was flying, or the bombs we dropped, or the men who died in aircraft that disintegrated around that impossible blur of motion and violence. And whatever it was, experimental aircraft using technology we didn't know existed, some kind of phenomenon that physics hasn't adequately explained, divine intervention if you believe in that kind of thing. or something else entirely that exists in the category of things that happen but can't be explained within our current understanding of how the world works. It saved our lives that day, saved 9 men who would have been shredded by those 14 fighters if something hadn't intervened with methodical brutality that still makes my hands shake when I think about it too carefully, when I remember the sound Harris made when he saw it, when I recall the expression on Sullivan's face as he tried to process what his eyes were reporting, when I think about the fact that somewhere above the Pacific Ocean in 1945, the rules stopped working for 8 seconds and then started again, leaving us to wonder what else was possible in those gaps where reality became negotiable. I still watch the sky sometimes, stand in the courtyard of this retirement home and look up at the clouds and wonder if the broken fighter is still up there, still erasing things that need erasing, still operating outside the rules that govern the rest of us who are trapped in bodies that break and machines that fail when pushed beyond their design specifications. And sometimes, when I see vapor trails from jets flying too high to identify, I imagine that maybe one of them is moving differently from the others, moving with that particular asymmetric grace that suggests damage or suggests something beyond damage, something that uses damage as camouflage while doing work that can't be explained or acknowledged. And I think that maybe that's the answer. Maybe the broken fighter wasn't broken at all, but was something that wanted to appear broken so that people like me would dismiss what we saw as impossible, rather than recognizing it as evidence of possibilities we hadn't imagined. And if that's true, then maybe it's still out there, still protecting people who don't know they're being protected, still moving through the sky, leaving behind debris and smoke and witnesses who will never be believed, because what they witnessed can't be fit into the official narrative of how wars are fought and how reality works, and what's possible when metal and intent combine in ways that engineering manuals say shouldn't function, but which function anyway because the universe is stranger than we admit, and war reveals that strangeness in ways that peace conceals. Tell me where you're watching from and subscribe. These memories deserve witnesses. Tentar novamente.